Thank you for listening to my talk about my crazy quilt collection. My name is Rita Meyerhoff, and I have been a self-taught sewer and crafter since I was young, particularly in the areas of cross-stitch and hand embroidery. In 1993, I tried quilting by making my first sampler quilt, and I loved it so much I soon shifted my craft work solely to quilting. In 2005, after moving to Colorado from Arizona, I took a crazy quilt class and realized that my years of craft experience had prepared me well to focus on crazy quilting. My love of embroidery found a new outlet, and now I do crazy quilting mostly by hand, but also by machine. I also love free motion quilting. Most of my training has come through taking classes from local Colorado quilters and teachers at the Houston International Quilt Festival. I also just learn by doing and developing new ideas through that experience. I enjoy all types of crazy quilting techniques, anything from developing a full-size quilt to making pincushions and wall hangings. Using old items in those new creations helps to honor the work of those done in the past. At the encouragement of others who appreciated my teaching and quilting expertise, I opened my own quilting business in 2008, which is Heaven's Quilts, where I am able to provide custom quilting services and teach others about quilting and crazy quilting. Heaven's Quilts is a home-based business that is a source for crazy quilt supplies, lace, both vintage and new, trims, buttons, beads, flowers, pincushions, and appliques, both hand-dyed and undyed versions. We also sell many of these crazy quilt supplies to the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum quilt store, as well as on Etsy. For many years, I have taught classes and conducted quilting demonstrations for local businesses and quilt guilds all over Colorado. Currently, I am a teacher for the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum, where I regularly teach crazy quilting and free motion. Heaven's Quilts also has several crazy quilt groups that meet monthly to learn new crazy quilting techniques. Recently, to support my quilt lectures and teaching, I have been collecting antique crazy quilts to not only illustrate the history of crazy quilting, but also help others learn the value of crazy quilts as an art form. When not quilting, I am a regular volunteer and docent at the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum and help support the museum's fundraising efforts. This first quilt is My Secret Garden. I made it in 2005 to 2007. It's 60 by 60, and it was machine pieced using a muslin foundation and machine quilted, but hand embroidered. This was my first crazy quilt, and it's very personal. It contains lace from my wedding dress, which was 40 years ago. That's crazy. The quilt has my favorite colors, silk ties from my husband, upholstery fabrics, and a hanky from my grandmother. It felt like I was always working towards making this crazy quilt. I love all kinds of handwork and embroidery as well as antiques. This quilt has faith, hope, and love as the cornerstone blocks. There's a beautiful hand-crocheted hanky in one of the blocks. Other embellishments include beaded flowers, interlacing circles and different threads, pearl cotton threads, a scalloped edge with fans, cross-stitch items, and found objects. Crazy quilting is not a fast process. It takes time and patience to do all the hand embroidery, but it is a process that I not only personally enjoy, but love to teach to others. For My Secret Garden, which won several awards, there's a small but elaborate cloth book with a poem about the quilt that's used as the label on the back of the quilt. I won't read it, but there is a saying or a phrase in the poem that says worth beyond beauty. And that not only repeats in the poem, but it really applies to all quilts because each quilt tells a story, but especially crazy quilts. This quilt is called Quilted Dreams. It was my second crazy quilt that I made. It took 5 years to make it, from 2009 to 2014. It was machine pieced, hand embroidered, and then free motion quilted using a silk Dupioni border. It was juried into the Houston International Quilt Festival in 2017, and it received an honorable mention at Colorado Quilting Council in 2016. It has two names because I accidentally forgot what the name of it was, and so one is Quilted Dreams and one is Quilt Your Dreams. There's actually a piece of fabric within the quilt that says Quilt Your Dreams, which is where the name comes from. Crazy quilting is not fast. It does take time and effort and dedication and lots of handwork and French knots. The ladies that take my class often laugh when I say at the end, just add more French knots. This quilt was meant to be totally cream, but I didn't like the colors, so I decided that just the background needed to be cream and the colors could be part of the fabrics or surface embellishments. Many of the motifs were just dreamed up and embellished after doing my first crazy quilt, so it's a little more elaborate than my first one. Motifs include fans, teacups, little girls, photo transfers, ribbons, bias flowers, rickrack roses, and lots of embroidery stitches. Motifs and flowers often had meaning in the older crazy quilts, such as owls meant wisdom, spider webs meant good luck, red roses meant I love you, while pink roses meant happiness, and yellow roses meant jealousy or infidelity. So depending on what you wanted to say, different things could have different meanings, which makes the crazy quilts even more of a statement of what that artist was trying to tell us. The threads and embellishment items in the older quilts are a little different from what we have today, where we have an endless supply of vintage and modern embellishments available. This next quilt is an 1885 crazy quilt that I purchased from Cindy Runnels, who's an antique dealer who often comes to the Houston International Quilt Festival. I bought this in 2019, and it was originally purchased at an estate sale in New York by Cindy. The quilt includes silk, velvet, grosgrain, ribbon, furnishing fabrics, plaids, stripes, and ombre, multi-tone jewel colors, foundation pieced, and hand embroidered. There is a traditional crazy quilt design with many shapes and sizes of fabrics. There are embroidered motifs such as a rooster head, a music conductor. It must have been somebody in her family, I think. Flowers, a crescent moon, stars, chenille work, and cattails made out of velvet. The initial L and date 1885 are fancily embroidered with variegated thread. Notably, there are 2 sets of Japanese fans in 4 locations on the quilt. This is a contained crazy with 36 blocks set side by side with 10.5-inch squares, and the backing is a stacked triangle cream cotton with minimal quilting. This quilt I actually purchased from the same dealer, Cindy Runnels, in Houston at the International Quilt Festival in 2019. It is probably 1890 to 1900. It doesn't have a date, but it does have a large C that's elaborately embellished in 2 places. Other motifs include a pine cone with branches, daisies, other flowers, and clover. The quilt also includes numerous embroidery stitches such as buttonhole, cross-stitch, satin, herringbone, French knots, and wheat sheaves. There are 49 blocks that are 10.25 inches square, but there's also an additional row of 7 half blocks, which are 4.75 by 10.25 inches at the top row. This was probably meant to be the top of the quilt, which could have been put there just to protect the rest of the quilt. Most of the fabrics in this quilt are challis, which is a combination of wool and silk. and honestly would have been considered a poor man's crazy quilt, but still very well done. The backing is envelope style with muslin on the back, and there's a 3/16-inch ribbon binding that was machine sewed to the front and then hand sewed to the back. This crazy quilt, I call her Mrs. B because there is a embellished letter B within the quilt, which I assume is the maker of the quilt. It's 1884, dated by the photo transfers that are in this quilt. They're also marked as Anderson Printing Company, which no longer exists. So because of the multiple transfers, we just assume it's from that time frame. Photo transfers actually came about before cameras did, amazingly enough. The story of this quilt is that a friend of mine was in an ARC store, thrift store, and peeking out from a stack of curtains was the edge of a crazy quilt. Mary knew she had found a treasure, so she immediately moved the crazy quilt to check it out and hurried to the front to pay the $15 for this quilt, which is worth quite a bit more than $15. I purchased the quilt from Mary in 2016 and then donated it to the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum in 2019. This quilt has a variety of techniques, lots of different threads. The ladies' embroidery skills were amazing. Every stitch on this quilt is just so well done. Lots of different threads, lots of different motifs. It's very creative. It's somewhat contained, but not totally, in that some of the blocks are obvious and some of the blocks are not so obvious because she took fabrics across seams and tried to hide the actual blocks themselves. So there's so much detail. We really feel that this maker was probably well off just because the amount of different fabrics and edging that's around the quilt was probably handmade. There's lots of little picot edges that are part of the lace that surrounds the quilt, as well as the velvet tabs, which is probably why it was in the curtain department. And someone just didn't realize what the treasure this quilt was. It's in excellent condition with only a couple of places where the silks are deteriorating, but for the most part, it is truly a treasure. The exhibit case in the museum's current quilt show has a number of items that I've collected over the years. There's a collection of sewing machine boxes, sewing machine miniatures, vintage scissors, a porcelain needle and thread box, which is a replica of a vintage thread box from the late 1800s. There's also a vintage miniature tomato pin cushion that belonged to my grandmother. There's Victorian crazy quilt cat that's made from velvets. There's also several Victorian lady pin cushions. The lady in blue wears a blue dress, which I made, but the other ladies are vintage. The Santa was actually purchased at the Houston International Quilt Festival in 2016 and was made by Ima, who makes different Santas with different themes using old quilts. It's presented so that you can see the back of the quilt, which is a 1903 crazy quilt, which is just beautiful, and he sits out in our house all year because it's just not right to put him away and hide his beautiful coat. Also in this case is a small miniature crazy quilt that I made a couple of years ago. It's called Keepsake Garden Crazy Quilt, and it's about 13 by 13, and the blocks are about 4 inches a piece. They were done on a muslin foundation, similar to a paper piecing technique, but the muslin stays put in place. This quilt is the third of 3 miniature crazy quilts that I created, and the first one had only 4 blocks, and it was given to a dear friend. The second was donated to the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum for Fabric and Friends, and I was supposed to purchase it back, but unfortunately someone else outbid me, so I do have visiting rights for that quilt. But this third miniature was made the intent that I would keep this one. It took me about 2 years to make. Mini quilts tend to use smaller items and plainer fabrics because they're so small that if you want to put anything on them, if there's a fabric that has a lot of texture or designs on it, it's harder to embellish that. So this quilt is made with all silk fabrics, and I use a size 12 pearl cotton. It contains my initials, mini buttons, small charms like a gecko and a dragonfly. And there's 2 interlocking rings, which represent my husband and myself, a bird cage, silk ribbon flowers, pearl kangaroos. Yes, there's a story for that, and hearts. The back of the quilt was tied with pearls using the fabric design on the backing fabric. The next set of quilts are all displayed in the museum's quilt shop. The first one is called Love to Quilt, Crazy Quilt, and it actually was displayed at the Denver Art Museum in the teaching room for about 6 months in 2012. During this time, the teachers came in and did public demonstrations of their craft, including myself. Crazy quilts are about moments, which means anything that catches your eye and causes you to look closer at the details. This one contains a rebus, which means saying something using pictures. This rebus is I love to quilt, and you just have to look and see if you can find that. The other characteristics are vintage trims, lace, hand-dyed lace, embroidered stitches such as buttonhole, detached buttonhole flowers, stem stitch, and couching. There are fussy cut fabrics as well as charms and silk ribbon. The beautiful lace collar and hanger are just for fun. This next crazy quilt that I'll talk about is called the white glove test. And you might be able to tell from the vintage white gloves that are on the quilt itself. They were just so beautiful and hand embellished with pearl seed beads that I just had to put them on something. This piece was machine pieced, hand embroidered, and free motion quilted by myself. The quilt block was originally part of the Cream Crazy quilt, Quilted Dreams, but it was needed as a sample for class, so I decided to combine my 2 favorite things, which are crazy quilts and free motion quilting. The vintage gloves with the seed beads were added as a final touch, hence the name of the quilt. Custom quilting with silk thread was done on the cream silk border fabric. I love teacups and tea and wish for a time when we sat with friends and visited over a good cup of tea. The teacup is outlined with gold thread, and the silk ribbon adds curves to soften the straight lines in the block. This next quilt is called Steampunk Crazy. It was actually done all by machine embroidery. The original blocks themselves were used as a demo at a quilting show just to show the process of Crazy Quilt's construction. But they needed something more, so I decided to add these steampunk embroidery designs from Oklahoma Embroidery Supply and Design Company. And those were added as an afterthought. And then I added the silk border to set it on point, which is another thing that I just love to do. I love the on point setting. The challenge was to find the correct border fabric, but the red swirl really complemented the final piece, which allowed an overall heart and swirl quilting pattern. And then the steampunk charms were added last. This is one of those quilts that you really have to get up close and personal to be able to see all of the detail. This last item is a Crazy Quilt pumpkin. I machine pieced this, hand embroidered and embellished using wool fabrics, but wool creates a whole nother issue when you try to work with it. There's just some challenges in stitching, but it definitely was worth the effort. Because of the nap, the stitches tend to sink down into the fabric, so you just have to be careful what you're doing and make your stitches a little bit larger so that they're more visible. the Crazy Cool Pumpkin is made from wool. The embellishments included cat charm, a key, a birdhouse, buttons, charms, flowers, and beads. The herringbone, buttonhole, and anchoring stitches and counting techniques were used, including rickracs, one of which is velvet. But I love the end result. Thank you for your time.